Well, good morning. Great to see all of you this morning. My name is Gary Weber. I'm the pastor here at Aspire Church San Marco, and it is good to be together. I loved waking up this morning and feeling the cooler weather outside. I love October. I love the baseball playoffs, even though my Braves are out already. I love college football, but I have something to admit to you this morning. There is division and fracture within your church. There are Phillies fans among us. And in just a few weeks, in what the nation knows as the biggest cocktail party in the Southeast, there is division among you. There are Florida fans and there are Georgia fans. And then there are some other fans called Seminoles. I don't know. There is division in our church. Now, we understand these divisions and we laugh at them. I remember when I moved to Huntsville, Alabama, I had not lived there very long when I was asked, well, which side will you be on? And I'm thinking, what are they talking about? Democrats, Republicans, I don't know what they're meaning. And they asked, the Iron Bowl was coming. Would I be rooting for Alabama or would I be rooting for Auburn? And I said, well, neither. I'm a Georgia fan. And they said, that was not acceptable. And I thought they were kidding until it was the weekend before the Iron Bowl, and literally our church had two sections, and literally on this side it was all crimson, on this side it was all orange, and they did not mix that day. There is division in the church in America. Now, we can laugh about that because we know it's all in good jest and fun, but there are other divisions in our world that have become all too obvious to us. They've become all too obvious to us because of the horrific death toll and the horrific acts that were done in the Middle East. And this isn't the first time, and apart from Jesus returning, it probably won't be the last time. We see the division very clearly, not just in the Middle East, but in other parts of the world and even in our own country. As you see the continued polarization of people pulling further and further apart from one another, it seems like we can't find enough reasons to be divided. Whether it's politics, whether it's race, whether it's religion, whatever it might be, we find more and more reasons to continue to divide ourselves. And the world becomes more and more fractured until you are left isolated, all on your own, because not anybody matches your complete identity of politics, race, religion, sports, whatever else you divide yourself over. We find ourselves continually fractured more and more and more and more. The Bible has something significant to say about this. In fact, the Apostle Paul, when he was writing to the Philippians, gave an important warning to the Philippians about this kind of idea, this kind of mindset. That even though this is the nature of the world in which we live, it is not to be the nature of the church for which Jesus gave himself. So I invite you to open your Bibles to Philippians chapter 3. We're going to look at verses 1 through 6 together. And we're going to see what Paul said about this fracturing. Finally, my brothers, rejoice in the Lord. To write the same thing to you is no trouble to me and is safe for you. Look out for the dogs. Look out for the evildoers. Look out for those who mutilate the flesh. For we are the circumcision, who worship by the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus, and put no confidence in the flesh, though I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh also. If anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. Paul is writing to the church at Philippi, and he's warning them against the fracture and the division that he knows is coming. See, there were two classes of Christian in this day and age, at the early part of the church. There were two classes of people. In fact, in the Jewish mindset, there were only two classes of people. There were Jews, and there was everybody else. They were called Gentiles. You think, well, maybe they were Roman, or maybe they were Greek, or maybe they were Persian. No. In the Jewish mindset, there were two classes of people. There were Jews and there were non-Jews. Those were the divisions. That's how they saw the world. That's how they viewed the world. And so as the church began to grow and as Christianity and the message of the gospel began to spread, there were basically two kinds of Christians. There were Jewish Christians, people who had been raised Jewish to understand the law of Moses, and through that had come to faith in Jesus. And there were the Gentiles, all those other people from all those different nations and places who had come to know Jesus, but weren't Jewish by birth, nor were they Jewish by practice. And so in the church at Philippi, as this church is beginning to grow and to blossom, a group of Jewish believers has come into the church, which is wonderful. It's wonderful. You're seeing the fulfillment of God's vision of the world, that there would be no division, that all people, whatever their nationality, whatever their tribe, whatever their language, whatever their tongue, would come together to worship their Creator. That's what was happening. But some of the Jewish Christians in Philippi had begun to speak against the Gentile Christians and requiring them to follow the Jewish laws. That if they wanted to be real Christians, if you want to really be a Christ follower, then you also have to, and they would begin to list off the laws, chief of which would be circumcision. You have to be circumcised in order to be a good Jew, and you have to be a good Jew in order to be a Christian. And you see the fracture and the division in the church is coming, and Paul is writing to them saying, be careful about this. Now, this sounds like a specific localized problem, so you think, well, what does it have to do with us today? It has everything to do with us today. But in order for us to get a big picture of this, we need to go back and do a wider view of humanity and what's been going on from the very beginning. Because you know the story, Adam and Eve in the garden, perfect communion with each other, perfect communion with the Father, as long as they abstained from one thing, and that was eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Basically determining for themselves what was right and wrong. As long as you can allow me, as long as you can trust me to determine what is right and what is wrong is eating of this tree, then we will live in perfect community with each other, with creation, and with your God. But of course, that's never what we want, is it? We always want self-determination, always. And so Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and there was a fracture between God and Adam and Eve. But that fracture soon resulted in a fracture in humanity itself. Because the very next generation after Adam and Eve, there came two brothers. And you might be familiar with the story of Cain and Abel, but in Genesis 4:8, we read this. Cain spoke to Abel, his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. There was division now, not just between humans and their creator, there was now division among people. Cain killed Abel because he was jealous. He was angry that Abel had made an offering that was more suitable to the Lord, more pleasing to the Lord. And so what did he do? He killed his brother. Now, at this point, you can continue to follow the lineage of Cain down through the ages. You can read about his lineage. But there's another son that is born to Adam and Eve. His name is Seth. And Seth also has a genealogy. And so you see these two genealogies. Cain, the outcast son who killed his brother Abel, and Seth, who would go on, and through his line, you would come down through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all the forefathers, and then King David, and then the line of David all the way to Jesus. But what you would find in this division was that there was murder and intrigue going on. In fact, Genesis 4:23 and 24 says this. Speaking, this man Lamech is being quoted. He says, I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. Now, what does that obscure verse have to do with anything? What it shows us is there's a continued deterioration among the human race. There's more and more and more division. That Lamech has murdered this person because he's been offended. But what you find is that the whole thing is beginning to unravel. People are fracturing. They're fracturing on family lines. They're fracturing based on where they live. They're fracturing more and more and more. Until you find in Genesis 6, verse 5 and 6, the Lord said that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the pain of a father who is watching his family disintegrate? Some of you can't imagine that because you've seen it. You've seen it in your own family. Divisions rise up between siblings or between grandparents or between divorced parents, and you see the fracturing that happens. This is nothing new. This has been going on since the very beginning. And it grieves the Father's heart to look at his creation, people who were all created in his image, and he watches them kill one another and hate one another and accuse one another and lie about one another, to the point that the scripture says he regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. But the old divisions continued. There was only one way in which the world was united, and that was in its rebellion against God. They were united around that idea. And so what you see in Genesis chapter 11 is that mankind got together and they marshaled all their resources and their newest technology, and they were going to build a tower to reach the heavens because they didn't need God to get there. They could do it out of their own power. They could do it out of their own strength. They could do it out of their own ingenuity. And so in Genesis 11, verse 4 and 5, then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." Now, there's a commandment that God had given to Adam and Eve at the very beginning. He said, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." He repeated it after the flood with Noah, to Noah and his children. He said, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." This idea was that God wanted the glory, his glory and his image to fill the earth as the waters cover the sea, the Psalms say. But what had man done? In rebellion, man had failed to cover the earth. They had failed to fulfill God's vision and calling on them to fill the earth with his glory and his image. And instead, they were all gathered together in their rebellion. Lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the towers which the children of man had built. And you know what happened? He dispersed them. The very thing they were trying to avoid is the very thing that happened. See, through their own effort, through their own ingenuity, they're going to build this tower, make a name for themselves. They were going to find a way to solve their problems on their own. All the fracturing of society, all the fracturing of cultures, all the fracturing of religions, they were going to bring it together themselves out of their own power. And God said, it'll never work. And so he dispersed them over the face of the earth. And what was supposed to be a mission became a punishment. See, the mission was to fill the earth with the image of the glory of God, and instead, because they hadn't done that, God dispersed them against their will. Now, there's a difference between the Bible that we read and the history we get from the Bible and how we've come to understand history since the Enlightenment. Now, if you went to school, and whatever level of history you went to in high school, or if you went on to college and took beyond your required college history classes, you will know that if you were going to learn history, you were going to learn dates, and you were going to learn names, and you were going to learn specific geographic places. This Enlightenment view of history was, in order to understand history, you need to understand these very specific dates and specific places. The Bible doesn't tell us history like that. The Bible tells us history through narratives. It tells us something broader than that. It's a larger narrative. The biblical text tells us that humanity, basically what it's been telling us from Genesis 1 through Genesis 11, especially from Genesis 3 through Genesis 11, the history of mankind is that humanity is fragile. Humanity is so fragile, the whole thing could fall apart. And it often does, doesn't it? It often does. And so people in the Middle East who are living with a very fragile sense of peace and security, it's blown up in a minute. In just a minute. And listen, lest you think that living where you live, when you live, somehow shields you from that, you, my friend, are deceived. Because humanity is fragile. Society is fragile. Life is fragile. And the Bible reminds us of this, as it says the whole thing could just fall apart. And it has fallen apart over and over again, and it falls apart across the very lines over which we divide ourselves. There's something like a cancer in the heart of humanity. There's something gnawing away at the very fabric of society itself. And it starts inside of me. It starts inside of my hatred and my division with my brother or my sister, and it extends from that, from one family to another, from one tribe to another, from one nation to another, and you see it. And it's on those very fault lines when things fall apart that they often do fall apart. Genesis 1 through 11 is about the decline. It's about the fragility of humanity and how everything is falling apart. Then there's a change in Genesis chapter 12. Listen to what it says as God begins to intervene in the disintegration of humanity. Genesis 12, verse 1 through 3. Now the Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your country," now that's a specific kind of tribe, your country, "and your kindred," another kind of tribe, "and your family's house," another kind of tribe, "to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." See, God is beginning to intervene and to unwind this destruction. That God was beginning to reverse the downward spiral. And how does God choose to do that? He chooses to do that through one person, whom by his grace he selects out of the multitudes of people on the earth. He selects them. God wants to bless all the people and plans to do it through this man named Abraham. See, there's a new need God recognized for a new kind of humanity, a new tribe of people. Not a tribe that will be for themselves and for their own good and seeking their own welfare, but a tribe of people who will be set apart by God in order to be a blessing to all the nations of the earth. See, tribes are typically about themselves, but this tribe exists for the benefit of all people. God is beginning a resistance movement. He's beginning a counterinsurgency against the consequences of sin and the division and the hatred that fills the earth. So he starts with an individual. He starts with Abraham. This impossible situation that Abraham would become a father when he's 75. And as he gets older and older and time passes and it looks less and less possible. But God does eventually fulfill his promise and Abraham has a family. But even in that family, you already see the division. Because of Abraham and Sarah's lack of faith, they give birth to a child through Sarah's handmaiden. And the division continues. And the seeds of tribalism are back in this very tribe that God is trying to bring out of this a blessing for all humanity. God's beginning this resistance movement, but you already see the counterinsurgency happening. So this family goes on, and you see Jacob and his 12 sons, and this family becomes a nation, the nation of Israel, and eventually God calls this nation of Israel to be a blessing to all the earth. Genesis 17, 9 through 11. And God said to Abraham, "As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. And this is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you." Something really pleasant to talk about on a Sunday morning, circumcision, right? I had a parent recently tell me, "Gary, would you warn us when you're talking about circumcision? Because I have to answer some very uncomfortable questions when we leave church when you do." This is a tribal ritual that God is giving this new tribe that he is setting apart. It is to be something that identifies them. It's a tribal identification. Who is serious about being this kind of person? Who is serious about passing this on to the next generation? Now, before we think this is ridiculous and barbaric, let me just show you a picture of some Georgia Bulldog fans. Right? Who is serious, right? Who is going to mark their body in such a way that you will be set apart. Now, lest you think I'm unfair and biased, I will show you Florida fans. Now, I picked this picture on purpose because I think it was the last time this tribe actually had a chance. Now, this is silly, right? We think it's silly. But what's the point here? What's the point? Is that there is something that sets you apart, that marks you, and God himself gave this new tribe, this new form of humanity, something that was setting them apart. Who wants to be this kind of person? Who wants to be serious about passing this on to the next generation? And here's the thing. Here's the question that comes out of this, because this is the very act that Paul's writing about to the Philippians. Because at this point, Paul is asking us to consider a very important question. Does your tribal identity prevent you from helping the common human good? Because something significant changed when Jesus came about. The whole purpose of the nation of Israel was to set the stage to be a blessing to the rest of the world. But you see, by the time Jesus comes on the scene, they are not doing that. They are huddled again in their tribal mentality. And Jesus steps onto the stage as a Jew from the line of David, himself being from the line of Abraham. And he's reminding them, hey, remember your calling. Remember why God set you apart. To be a blessing for all the nations, for all people. And so this tribal identity that had set the Jews apart had become something that they began to use to isolate themselves and differentiate themselves. And they lost sight of their mission. They lost sight of the purpose that God had given them. And when Jesus tried to call them back to that very calling, the original calling that God the Father had put on them, they crucified him. They crucified him. Because how could this message, how could God be for those people? Because he's our God. And this is finding its way into the church. As people are saying, it's not enough for you to put your faith in Jesus. You have to also put your faith in this tribal identity. Now, this leads us back to a truth about human development. And this is true whether it's a newborn baby who grows into childhood and adolescence and into adulthood, or a culture or a society or a group of people. See, we all start out egocentric. The world revolves around me. And some of you know, some people never get over that, right? They never get past that. This is egocentric. The world revolves around me. But somewhere, we hope to grow from that. We hope to take a child and move them from being egocentric to being ethnocentric. What do I mean by ethnocentric? Well, parents help children to move from an egocentric worldview of the world to thinking more about the family. So we ask kids to make their beds. We ask them to clean up their rooms. We ask them to do chores. Because the world doesn't just revolve around you. In fact, now the child begins to see and understand maybe the world revolves around my tribe. Maybe the world revolves around my people. But that's not what God has called us to. From there, hopefully, God calls us and leads us out of egocentrism and ethnocentrism into becoming world-centric, that we are part of something bigger. When people become aware that their tribe's practices are not good for the world, they are forced to choose between their loyalty to the tribe and the higher good. Let me draw your attention back to Germany in 1938. As the tribalism of Nazism began to take over Germany, there were people in Germany who had to decide, will I continue to be focused on my tribe as the center of the world, or will I recognize that what my tribe is doing is causing harm to other people? It's not bringing about the vision of God's kingdom. It's in fact adding and contributing to the disintegration of humanity. And this applied to the nation of Israel. God had called them to be a light to the nations, and they refused. And instead, they settled into their tribalism. And this was where Jesus stepped in. And so when Jesus comes in, he brings to fulfillment the promise that God gave to Abraham. Not because those who would be born of the lineage of Abraham would become this new sort of people, this new tribe, but because those who would put their faith and trust in Jesus, people from every tribe, every name, language, every nation, every tongue, if they would put their faith in Jesus, that was what would bring about the unity. Not because we looked alike, we talked alike, we sounded alike, not because we all ate the same kinds of food, but the beautiful mosaic of humanity was to reflect the majesty and the glory of God, and it was to be united, not because we got rid of all distinctions, but because instead we understood that through Christ, the unity that could come about through his church was the only thing that could reverse the tribalism and the division that the world had seen. And it was creeping into the church at Philippi, and Paul is warning them, watch out, don't let this happen. This reminds me of our gospel in 30 words. Many of you have heard this before, but it's always a good opportunity to remind it. So let's just say it together. It's on the screen. Jesus is God with us, come to show us God's love, save us from sin, set up God's kingdom, and shut down religion so that we can share in God's life. Now, part of what Jesus came to do in setting up God's kingdom is the fulfillment of the very thing that God had called Abraham to do when he set him apart from the very beginning. This new kind of humanity. But in order to set up God's kingdom, Jesus also had to shut down religion. Why? Why shut down religion? Because that seems so contrary to everything that we even do here. Some of you may think, well, isn't this about religion? No. No. Why did Jesus shut down religion? Because religion at its root is tribal. Religion is tribal. This is what is going on in the Middle East even today. This is what has divided humanity over and over again. Almost every conflict that you can find in human history has been brought about through tribalism, and most of that tribalism, the brand of that tribalism, has most often been religious. But Jesus didn't come to set up a new religion. He came to shut down religion, to bring people together through the common faith in him as the hope. All you need to understand to see this is to watch religious cable channels, right? I mean, you watch religious cable channels, and the gospel is all about you and your kind of people. Let us let us do some market surveys and testing to see where we can get the greatest viewership, and that will be our target audience. And we take the gospel and we target it to those kind of people because those are our kind of people. And we go about creating Christian subcultures. We have Christian churches, which should be expected. But then we also have Christian schools and stores. Now, I have nothing against Christian schools or stores or Christian radio. But here's what I do know. When we continue to separate ourselves from the rest of society and create our subculture and dwell within our subculture, we are making the same mistake that the nation of Israel made as we isolate ourselves from the world. And the world is the very people that we have been called to reach and to bless with the good news of the gospel. And so we isolate ourselves more and more and more. Then someone encounters the resurrected Jesus, and they find themselves disconnected from their tribe because they begin to get criticism from their kind of Christian. You see, it's not just enough to come to faith in Jesus. You have to also be our kind of person in order to follow Jesus. This is tribalism. And it finds its way not just in the nation of Israel, it finds its way in churches and Christian culture even today. Sometimes when people say the gospel, what they really are talking about is their tribal identity. The church has to be more than that. This is what leads people to say, I don't have a problem with Jesus, I have a problem with that tribe. Because that tribe only divides people more and more. And Paul's telling the church at Philippi, do not do this. Do not fall into the same pit. This is at the very seeds of the problem of humanity, our desire to fracture and divide when the gospel is all about bringing people together. See, religion is tribal, but Jesus is bigger than your tribe. Religion is tribal, but Jesus is bigger than your tribe. In Philippi, people experienced the love of Jesus. They experienced the hope of the gospel. And then these other people came along and tried to insert their tribal tradition into the gospel. And Paul warns the people at Philippi about this. He gives them 3 warnings. First, he says, beware the dogs. Beware the dogs. Now, I will admit, on Florida Georgia weekend, I thought about spelling that D-A-W-G. but it was not the right message. 3 warnings. Beware the dogs, he says. Now, why is this important? Because Jews frequently used this word, dogs, to describe people who weren't Jewish. But what is Paul doing in this context? He's using the word dogs to refer to Jewish people. He's using the very term of derision they use against others, and he's using it against them themselves. And then he says, he goes further. If dogs weren't enough, he also calls them evildoers. Beware the evildoers. See, the Jews thought they were protecting their tribe from all the evil outsiders. But they were the ones promoting evil. They were the very ones promoting division. And then finally, he calls them mutilators of the flesh. Now, of course, when speaking about circumcision, you can see the connection, but in the Greek, it's even closer. You see, katatome, the Greek word katatome is the word that he used to talk about mutilators, and that means to cut to pieces. But peritome means circumcise. So they would call themselves the people of the peritome people, the circumcised people. Paul changed that to be the katatome people. All you are doing is trying to cut people apart. Jews thought they could cut around these people, cut them out. But what Paul was saying is they're actually going to cut the church to pieces if you allow this division in your church. So what does this have to do with us today? Well, the connection to our world is fairly obvious. Church, you see the division. You hear about it. And I'm just talking about the Middle East. I'm talking about in our own country. We're coming up on an election season. And I don't know about you, but I dread next year. I dread it. And I don't care who you're voting for. It is going to be ugly. As we are catatome, cut apart as a nation. And we have to ask ourselves as Christians, is that what we are called to be a part of? Or are we going to fulfill what Jesus has called us to do as being his church? Promoting the message of the gospel before we promote anything else. Understanding that if not for the gospel, there will never be peace. There will never be unity. If you want peace in the Middle East, the path to peace in the Middle East is the gospel of Jesus Christ. That is the path to peace in the Middle East. That is the path to peace in the United States. That is the path to peace in your family. That is the path to peace in your own divided soul. Because it is only Jesus that brings these things together. Everything else will just divide us more and more and more. So as a church, the warning for us, Paul's warning to the Philippians is the same warning to us. Beware of promoting your tribe over the message of the gospel. Beware of promoting your tribe over the message of the gospel. We're all part of tribes. The fact that you are here today, if you are a member of this church, that makes you a part of the Aspire tribe. I am not saying that you have to disassociate yourself from your family or your favorite college or your church or whatever. I am saying that when it comes to how we live as humans and live together, we have to put the message of the gospel over anything else that we use to identify ourselves. More than the color of your skin, more than the language you speak, more than your nation of origin, more than your political background, more than anything else, the message of the gospel has to be primary. Because if it is not primary, we will only continue to add to the division and to add to the hatred. The whole time while that we are doing it, we're in the meantime saying how much we love Jesus. Can I just tell you that that is blasphemous? To on one hand say that you love and follow Jesus, and on the other hand, be contributing to the division and the hatred in the world because you promote your form of tribalism over the message of the gospel. Any sense of superiority or judgment over any other group always pulls you away from the gospel. Any sense of believing that we are cooler, hipper, more relevant, more holy, more godly will distance us from the central message of the gospel. The central message of the gospel is that we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And that God, by his grace in Jesus Christ, has brought about redemption to everyone who would believe. Church, when we get serious about that message, when we get serious about sharing that message before we share any other message, then we will see the hope of heaven begin to permeate this world. But until then, may we be a people who stand boldly for the gospel, who do more than just have a slogan that says, love everyone always, but we commit ourselves to aspire to live that way each and every day as the message of the gospel overcomes the divisions and the hatred that we see all around us.